In the early 2010s, we were all introduced to a lot of new vocabulary when it came to describing our experiences as marginalized people. Things like microaggressions and cultural appropriation and diaspora wars started to filter in through our social media, and more of us were able to put a name to these experiences that we've been having since we were young. Now, if you're Black and you see the title of this episode, Diaspora Wars, you already know, and I'm sure you're rolling your eyes as we speak. But for those who are here who don't know what I'm talking about, let's get into some things. Diaspora Wars is kind of a cheeky term that someone came up with probably on Twitter, where it described the intra-racial dynamics between different diasporas. Now, I'd like to say that the African diaspora coined this term. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I already know that there is other intra-racial diaspora wars that go on in the Asian diaspora and the Latinx diaspora. I am aware of that. But today, as we all know, we're going to be discussing the African diaspora. If you don't know what a diaspora war is, essentially, it is a time in social media, and this happens, I would say, every month or maybe 1 to 2 months when someone who's famous, lately it was Kai Cenat, there have been other famous people like Akon and, what's his name? Emilio Acho, that annoying guy who has those uncomfortable conversations on YouTube with white people. It typically starts when they say something like, well, I'm not Black American, so I don't relate to the struggles of being Black American, or Black Americans have no culture, or, Black Americans are lazy and we're different than them. As soon as someone influential says something like that publicly on their socials, in an interview, whatever, it usually sets the timeline in a frenzy for about 5 to 6 days. Like, everyone's going at each other, everyone's clocking each other, everyone's discussing why or why not that was an appropriate thing to say. But what is always the center of the conversation is a Black American experience. And it's usually talked down negatively from Black people or African people from other parts of the world. Now, if you're wondering what a diaspora is a dispersion or the spread of a peoples from a specific centralized location. So in our case, in the African diaspora, you know that the motherland is Africa. Obviously, we know that the motherland is Africa. We know this, but we all, through the slave trade, were transferred to other places that we exist in. African Americans are obviously descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the African communities in places like Jamaica, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, the list goes on and on. Black people are everywhere, and usually they got there by being forced onto a boat and being forced somewhere to perform free labor for Europeans at some point. So the word diaspora is a name used to describe that natural or unnatural spreading of people from a centralized location. So as I said, there's Asian diaspora, there's, Latin diaspora, there's all sorts of different diasporas that we coexist within, but I think the African diaspora has to be one of the most active on social media, just publicly going at each other. At least that's what I've seen. To be clear, the African diaspora includes Africans from mainland Africa, West Indians, Afro-Latinos, African Americans, the list goes on and on. You get it. You know what I'm talking about. In this episode, we're going to be, again, this is a mixing of 2 scripts. So we're going to be talking about the diaspora wars, of course, and why I think they exist. But of course, we'll be providing historical context as to why I think the diaspora wars between the African diaspora, those in the community with being in the African diaspora, exist, why, how, all of the good, bad, the ugly things, and why I think it's directly related to the different ways slavery existed in these specific areas. Let's get into it. Welcome to Bloodstained, episode 2. African diaspora wars are a bore. I don't exactly recall the first time I heard the word Diaspora Wars, but I remember starting to understand what that meant after watching a panel discussion on YouTube. There used to be a YouTube channel called The Grapevine. I think they changed their name to Strange Fruit, if I'm not mistaken. If I can find the episode, I'll link it in the description. But The Grapevine was an incredible YouTube series that came into popularity during this 20 teens time, where a lot of these new vocabulary words and understanding of the marginalized experience started to become more mainstream, right? The Grapevine was a panel discussion where they talk about something that happened in pop culture or something that's going on within our specific diaspora, our specific community that was important to talk about. They talked about colorism, cultural appropriation, interracial dating, all sorts of things, political affiliations, immigration, all sorts of conversations. And the first time that I remember actually physically being confronted with the existence of the Diaspora Wars was through their panel discussion. Now, the panel discussion was not called Diaspora Wars. It was a discussion, it was a 3-part discussion where you had African Americans, you had West Indians, and you had African. The 3-part discussion was African Americans talking about their personal experience with West Indians and Africans. And then it was West Indian Africans talking about their experience with Black Americans. Then the third and final installment was all of these groups having a discussion together about how they felt supported or non-supported by the people within their diaspora. I had no idea the Diaspora Wars existed, but after watching that series through, me as a second generation Jamaican American started to understand a little bit of the dynamics between being purely African American and being West Indian. My mom's parents immigrated here in the 50s and 60s and were able to build a very successful life for themselves and, my mom subsequently as well. And my mom's experience was very much being a first generation, first daughter to immigrant parents. Her entire community was Seventh-day Adventist or West Indian or some combination of the two. And she grew up in a very insulated dynamic. A lot of who she interacted with, who she socialized with, was within the immigrant community of being West Indian in the United States, particularly being West Indian and Seventh-day Adventist in Southern California, which is a small but mighty group of people. So my mom truly, truly had the experience of being a first-generation kid and having West Indian parents, and what that experience is like. Having immigrants as parents is a completely new experience because you are having a completely different life than what your parents had. And you know that they brought you here or they had you here for the intention of giving you a better life, right? So there's a lot that goes into that. And, my dad is second generation Jamaican, but very Americanized. And it was kind of this best of both worlds thing where even though my grandparents on my dad's side were Jamaican adjacent, at the end of the day, my grandfather on my dad's side was Jamaican. He grew up but very Americanized. So I had this experience of having my immigrant Jamaican grandparents on my mom's side, as well as having this very Americanized experience, And I didn't realize until watching that Grapevine panel discussion that some of the things that, people within the West Indian diaspora, or even certain things that my mom would say or my grandparents would say, were a little bit, judgmental, to say the least, when it came to the African American experience. I didn't necessarily really think about that or think that I was raised with that kind of mentality until, after watching this, you're hyper aware. Hindsight is 2020. And there was a bit of othering of their experience versus being just African American, if you know what I mean. Not hateful, I wouldn't say, but just little comments that you started to notice. There are just certain things you started to realize after watching that episode where, I had a very specific experience, and that was based on the fact that my grandparents were West Indian. You know what I mean? In the grapevine discussion, it gets really heated, and there is hurt on all sides of the conversation. There's hurt on the sides of African and West Indian immigrants or children of immigrants of, seeing the experience that their parents went through or that they went through in trying to fit in the African American community and feeling barred out, like, you're different than us. You have an accent. The xenophobia started to kick in. You know what I'm saying? And on the flip side, you had conversations with African Americans who, said, I've been discriminated against and treated like, like a ghetto, ratchet, lazy piece of shit stereotype from people from Africa or the West Indies.
Whoa. Before we go any further, I need to interact with you a little bit, just like you should be interacting with this video. Yeah. Okay, like the video, it won't hurt you, it won't cost you anything. Subscribe to the channel. Yeah, interact with this, comment your thoughts. We need the engagement to boost us in the algorithm. We're small but mighty, and I want to grow. That's number one. Number two, I just thought, since I don't have any sponsors yet, if you're a sponsor, reach out to me. But I thought I have ad space to fill with my own shit, so why not do it? So, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to advertise one of the most important cornerstones of the Matiswan channel that I've been working on while I've been away. Let's talk about it. That, my dears, is my Substack. So if you've never heard about Substack, come close. Let's talk about it a little bit. It is but another way for us to talk with each other more directly, create community, and for you to get to know me more as a person. My Substack is basically like an email list turned webpage, turned blog, turned podcast. It's a bunch of different things, child. Now, my Substack is called The Swan Letter because I'm Matiswan and this is the Matiswan channel, and you guys are all my little swans. Yeah. The Swan Letter is going to be all things me, all things content, all things more deeply me. And I'm excited to explain a little bit about that to you in this ad space. I think we all need a break, get up and stretch, eat your snack. Let's talk about it. What you can expect from my Substack is weekly newsletters from me discussing some of my previous videos from a more retrospective lens, which is fun. You can expect a monthly blog post about my hyperfixations and the things I've been obsessed with. 2. 3, you might get a random video here or there. If I want to comment on something or something in pop culture is happening, I'll do it on my Substack and post it up there. It's a way for you to interact with me directly and get to know who I am outside of the content that I produce, if that makes sense. Go to the description, down below, click the link that says Substack here, click it, click that link, and put your email in. Now, there are 2 ways you can subscribe to my Substack. There's a free version and there's a paid version. In the free version, you will be able to interact with the free blog posts and newsletters, okay? I might post a video here or there if I feel compelled to, but if not, it's okay. You will get a weekly guaranteed blog post from me. Those blog posts are about my previous true crime style YouTube videos, my retrospective on those things, why I chose those cases and stuff like that. You will get a monthly blog post from me about what I'm hyperfixated with for the month, whether it's music, podcast, book, makeup, food, a place to go, something, this robe that I got for my birthday, which I love, my hyperfixations, what I'm obsessed with, recommendations, and I hope you take heed, and whatever else I want to post. I might want to post more often some months, other months I might not post as often, but you will definitely always get a weekly blog post about my YouTube videos. You will also receive a monthly blog post with my movie of the month that I'm doing on my other tier of Substack that I'm doing a movie reaction to, and you will get just a rundown of what I thought about the movie, a review of the movie, and all of that kind of thing. But that's what you can expect from the free tier. So what you would do is hit the link in the description, and then you would go to the page, you type in your email, and that's it. That's all you have to do to sign up. You will be abreast of everything new that's going on the channel, what's going on with me, pretty much. Now, for the paid tier, you're going to get a little bit more. Now, you'll get all of the things that I just mentioned, of course, all access to that. You will also get an additional monthly vlog from me where I show you just different clips of what I did that month, the things I did, the people I was with, the things I loved, the things I hated, just narration of my life for the year. You will get the additional bonus episode of the month where I will be doing and uploading a movie reaction where I react to a slave movie. As you know by now, the topic of Bloodstained is slavery for season 1. So I will be doing and uploading monthly movie reactions where I watch a slave movie, tell you my thoughts about it, we watch it together, you can comment on that and interact with me there. You will also get a monthly blog post where I detail some YouTube tips if you're an aspiring YouTuber or content creator. Just little tips that I think that it's important for anyone who's just starting out to know. That will also be included. On top of that, you guys will be first to know of any merch, of any pre-sales, of anything like that. So be aware of that. And I am in the middle of writing a novel. And I would love your guys' input on it. And I will be posting excerpts on the paid substack from here and there, just to see what you guys think about it. Now, all of that you will get from the paid version. So you'll get everything that I said from the free version, as well as all of those extra things from the paid version. Now, you may be wondering, all of that stuff, how much does a paid tier cost? The paid tier is $5. $5 a month. And you'll get all of that extra content from me. So I hope you're into that. I hope you're excited for it. Hit the link in the bio to go to my Substack and become a follower, become a subscriber to the newsletter to the Swan. Subscribe to the Swan letter. Mwah.
People saying that, they had friends at school who were immigrants and their parents didn't want them to hang out with them because they were African American. So I just want to come into this discussion openly and honestly and just have a bit of understanding. There's hurt on both sides. And just as I described to you, I'm kind of at this liminal space between the two identities. I definitely identify as being second generation Jamaican American for sure, but I am extremely Americanized. So I feel for my straight up African American brothers and sisters. But that's why when this conversation comes up on social media, I tend to take a step back and let fully African American people take the reins of the conversation of their hurt, of their trauma, of their situations, and let them, lead the pushback when the Diaspora Wars inevitably become a topic. I think it's important that within this conversation, within this podcast, within Bloodstained, we hammer home some of the unintended or maybe intended effects of slavery, fracturing of the African diaspora, and how that was used by white supremacy to have us forever at odds with each other, to have us unable to create a unified identity based on where we all were originated from, and how that in and of itself and the intentionality of that happening is a true crime story that has affected the way that we can all relate to each other and unify. A lot of our issues stem from the same people. A lot of the same things control our existence and have affected our history personally. Yes, they may be different. Yes, there may be locality specific things that affect us, but at the same time, the same people are subjugating us, are, abusing us, are oppressing us. And I think that is the most centralized thing that I want to hammer home here. Now, it's important that we discuss this very openly and honestly, because I think when it comes to slavery, at least when you learn about it in North America, you think that it started at 1619. You think that we are the center of the universe, the sun in the solar system when it came to slavery. And the reality is, like I said in episode 1, we had the least amount of slaves coming from the African continent and landing in North America. It was like 5%, single digit percentile, okay? Most slaves in the transatlantic slave trade that were taken from Africa ended up in Central and South America or the Caribbean. Now, and when I say most, it's not even close. It's like 40% went to Brazil, and the remaining percentile went between other countries in Central and South America and the Caribbean. So it's important to really hammer that home, that even though we think slavery started in North America at 1619, the transatlantic slave trade led by the Portuguese had been in existence and in full effect for nearly a century before that. And we just were late to the party, kind of thing. Now, I do want to clock this because I know that we mostly say, okay, 1619, the first group of Africans came to Virginia. That's kind of where, as a historical community, we decide was the originator, was the starting point in America. The truth of the matter was, there was a group of African slaves that were taken from Africa to, I believe, South Carolina. Don't quote me on that. It was one of the Carolinas. It was another little colony in that area. And in the 1500s, in the late 1500s, the only thing was it didn't last. The enslaved were able to escape their bondage, and they were able to build and make community with the indigenous Native Americans, and they just all escaped, and they were never really seen again. It's rumored that they made kind of a joint community, a joint relationship with the Native Americans, and continued to live their lives. But I just want that to be known, because yes, we say, okay, the formalized slave trade that we know and understand probably started in 1619, but that was not the first time that African enslaved individuals were brought to North America. Now, when we talk about colonizers, OG colonizers, a lot of times the Portuguese are able to escape scot-free for some reason, when really they were the originators for a lot of this shit. In the age of exploration, in the age of establishing the transatlantic slave trade, they were miles ahead than other European nations, sending out ships to explore, sending out ships to do the slave stuff. They were miles ahead. So I find it weird that we never really give them the heat that they deserve and blame them for the way that we all are forced to live our lives, because a lot of it is based off of them. They were the OG colonizers, for real. And they were well in the swing of the transatlantic slave trade in the late 1400s and into the early 1500s, as I was saying before. It is recorded that in 1504, a Portuguese merchant ship brought a group of enslaved Africans to Scotland. This was one of the first recorded instances of slaves being brought to Scotland. And so I really want us to understand that the slave trade had been working like a well-oiled machine for years before North America and the colonies really got their feet wet in the industry. Now, in 1505, right after the first group of enslaved Africans were brought to Scotland by the Portuguese, this is the first recorded date of the growing of sugarcane in the Dominican Republic. And naturally after that, the slave trade really started to pick up in those particular regions. In 1509, Christopher Columbus's son, so you know he's a great person, was awarded land and control over the land in the Dominican Republic. And he would complain often that the indigenous people on the island of the Dominican Republic made horrible slaves. And that is when an uptick in the exporting of enslaved Africans to this specific area in the Caribbean started to really gain steam. By January 1510, the start of the systematic transportation of Africans from the continent to the Americans and the Caribbeans started to really take hold, and King Ferdinand officially allowed the first 50 enslaved Africans to be brought to the Dominican Republic. In 1516, though, the first ever slave rebellion on a slave ship took place that was successful. They killed all of the Portuguese sailors aboard and were able to turn that ship back home to Africa, period. They were not saying, shout out to Kanye, that people did fight back. But I just thought I'd throw that in there just to say, we fought back at every opportunity that we could fight back, point blank, period. By 1518, so 9 years after Christopher Columbus's son takes control of the Dominican Republic, this is where a significant uptick in the dependence and the need for that systematic slave trade started to kind of explode. This is when Charles V allows his Flemish courier Lorenzo to import 4,000 enslaved Africans from the continent of Africa to what is considered New Spain. I say all of these things to point out that the transatlantic slave trade is by no means an American construction, a colonial construction, a North American construction. We entered the chat, or at least our official origin point that we all kind of agree on is 1619. That is over a century late. They were ramping up the transatlantic slave trade and the dependence on African slaves in 1518. So we entered the chat late. And if we are going to talk about slavery, we have to talk about it and include that 95% of slaves did not come to the North America, did not come to the colonies. And so discussing their experiences and how that shapes the descendants of slaves in those regions' perceptions of us, perceptions of themselves, is integral in understanding the true effects of the transatlantic slave trade. We can't cut off 95% of our people and sit here and think that we're talking about this in good faith. We have to at least touch on a few global things. We can't just centralize America in this conversation because it is important. Now, as we know, it was about 5%. 5% of the enslaved Africans that were brought through the Middle Passage ended up in North America, in the colonies, in the modern day United States. But by 1825, in the U.S. population of enslaved Africans were responsible for being 1/4 of the African descendants in the Western Hemisphere. And that is purely due to the unique way they were able to exist in the colonies versus in the Caribbean and Central and South America. There was a different culture around the use of your slaves in North America and the colonies. It became advantageous to take care of your slaves at least a little bit more, to take care of your investments at least a little bit more, and encourage breeding within them in order to grow your wealth and your population. You didn't have to then go directly to the African continent to always import these slaves, especially when slavery was outlawed internationally. You didn't have to go to Africa to get these slaves. Once you had a big enough population in the United States, you started to breed your own slaves. We are going to get into breeding plantations and all of that when we talk about Black women and slavery in the United States. That's a later episode. But understand that there was a point when the people in the colonies stopped depending on the transatlantic slave trade to get new slaves, but they were still able to populate new slaves because they were breeding their slaves locally to America, right? This is where I think the first real severance between African Americans and the motherland really started, because the culture in Central and South America and the Caribbean was much more brutal. We're going to get into a specific example of the brutality of what it was like to work as a slave in those plantations later on. Actually, that's the next episode, so get into that. We're going to talk specifically about Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. But it's important to understand this because there was a difference in how these slaves were seen and treated. It may have been slightly better, if you can say that, but, depending on how you want to put it. Prolonging the torture, prolonging your existence of being a slave versus by getting, better health care, clothing, doctor visits, being actually fed and taken care of and, but forcefully bred and all of those things. I mean, no oppression Olympics here. I think it's all fucking horrible. But to be viewed simply as a disposable tool, which was much more of the relationship between slaves and their masters in Central and South America and the Caribbean, is distinctly different because no one could breed there. The conditions were so dire and they were thought so little of that it was more advantageous to just let a slave work themselves to death and then, replace them. It was more cost effective for them to just work their slave population to death and then just replace them. So there was this influx of enslaved Africans coming to this region more for demand than anything, because they were working these people to another degree, working for these people, torturing these people, and not caring if they were injured, if they were sick, if they were starving. They didn't care because you would die and then you would just be replaced, disposable, completely disposable. Now, I think this mentality also comes along because of the different ways that the plantations existed in the colonies versus Central and South America and the Caribbean. Now, I've explained this before, and we'll explain it in greater detail in the Haitian Revolution episode, and how that was an unexpected twist, even though the demographics were clearly in the favor of the Haitians revolting. But the plantations in America were very profitable, obviously, but they were not big scale. They were not commercial plantations. These were family businesses. These were family farms. And they, again, very profitable. But it was very unusual for a plantation owner to own more than about 100 slaves. If you owned 100 slaves in the United States, you were like one of 10 people. And you were really, really wealthy. But it wasn't the norm. Most people had 30 slaves, 10 slaves, any kind of variation between that number. But to have 100 or above was extremely rare in the United States, because these were family-owned plantations. These were family-owned farms. Now, in Central South America and the Caribbean, right, these were colonies. And yes, the United States was a colony in and of itself to England. We know that. But these were specific colonies, and they were colonies meant to be used for their raw materials to be sent and enrich the motherland, right? Now, there's this relationship, obviously, with England and, North America, what would become America, which is complicated. People actually live there, families actually live there and built lives there in their settler colonial way. So it was just a different relationship between our mother country and America as a colony. Families lived there. People existed there. In this specific case, in Central and South America and the Caribbean, those lands were used as commercial plantations. The idea of these lands were, the indigenous people will be enslaved. We're going to get some Africans up in here. We're going to get upwards of 300 enslaved Africans every few months, and we're going to work them to death. We're going to have massive plantations that are, sugarcane, you had tobacco, you had coffee, you had indigo, you had massive commercial scale plantations. And the sole reason why anyone from Europe was inhabiting this land was to either oversee the slaves on the plantation, to own the slaves on the plantation, and facilitate the sale of all of this stuff back to the motherland. But this was not a family place. This was not like America, where, you had a family, you also owned slaves. That was kind of the family business. This was, my family's in France, my family is in Portugal, my family's in Spain, my family's here. I'm here running the plantation, and I go visit them every few months or once a year or whatever, bring them gifts, bring them money or whatever. But I'm away from my family because I'm doing my job. So the entire economy, the entire social society was centralized in slavery, which was not true in North America, in the colonies. That wasn't the centralized part of existing in society in the colonies. There was different cultures, there's different societal things. In these areas, the centralizing thing that everyone was a part of, that everyone was attached to, was fucking slavery. So because of that, and because of these commercial plantations needing constant flow of new slaves coming, new enslaved Africans coming in, the population demographics of those colonies were, 95% on the side of the enslaved Africans, and like 5%, maybe 10% of Europeans who were overseeing or who owned the land. Now, to me, that is a dangerous situation to be in. You're torturing these people, you're starving these people, you're working these people to death, but you have no conception that they look at you as their enemy. You don't think they have the balls, they have the smarts, they have the ability to organize against you. And unfortunately, specifically in the Haitian Revolution's conversation, which we will get into more detail about in the next episode, that was a massive mistake, because the idea of the African enslaved individual as a racial hierarchy started to really settle in was truly that we were subhuman. We were like closer to apes. So the idea of a revolution or having military strategy or organizing, that is not something they even considered that these enslaved Africans could ever do. So they happily would torture these people, work these people to death, not understanding they're building an entire army where they're outnumbered like crazy that despises their existence. Okay. The few ruling over the many never works out. It always collapses, no matter how you slice it, no matter where you are. It always collapses, because at the end of the day, the few is purely dependent on the work of the many. So you can't sit here in good faith and treat me poorly, because when I start to realize that my labor is enriching you and you're dependent on me, well, that's when you're in for a world of hurt. So there is a separation, and I think that's important, because the way slaves experienced their lives and existed in these specific communities, there was this constant flow of people from Africa. So I feel like there was also this real closeness to the roots of the African continent that were able to infiltrate in that culture in those areas. Whereas in the Americas, there was a point where we were just like, you can keep, getting slaves from Africa proper. We're just going to breed within ourselves. We have enough people to just breed. We're going to just take care of them a little bit more. And we can just have a closed loop population growth under our control. We're breeding them, we're sleeping with them, we're creating our own workforce. Whereas in these other areas, Central, South America, and the Caribbean, they needed that constant flow from Africa. So the enslaved there actually had roots to Africa, actually lived there, actually remember, actually have history and traditions that they brought over. Whereas there were some of those Africans, of course, that came to the Americas, but over time, as we created the closed loop system of breeding our own people, that is when, people started to get less and less familiar with African traditional culture that was not being brought in this, open-ended faucet kind of way. And I think that is another sticking point, a very important sticking point of the severing between the identity of being African and being African American. I just want to talk about this real quick, because this is a topic of discussion even now as Roe v. Wade is stripped from the table and all of this stuff. But the replacement rate was a real thing. So again, think about this, like in the Americas, because they were able to be quote unquote better, have better conditions of life, whatever that's compared to, and they were able to actually give birth, they were actually able to keep up the replacement rate. So for example, if me and my boyfriend are planning, which we are planning to have kids, if we only have one kid, we are not doing the due diligence of having enough kids to replace ourselves. So because it takes two people to tango, in order to keep the replacement rate balance in the population, you have to have at least two kids, right? So when it came to slave populations, the brutality in Central and South America, in the Caribbean, was so intense that ultimately what would happen was, the birth rates would tank because people would be dying, and they could not keep up a replacement rate because of how the culture of working their slaves to death. So they could not ever replace themselves. So that's why this need from the African continent, this constant flow, needed to happen and needed to stay open, because their culture of working their slaves was so brutal. Again, this is really important. So mercantilism, I got people, I talked about this on my TikTok and people were dragging me for my pronunciation, but that's how I'm pronouncing it. Mercantilism, whatever, is this concept I understood it as one of the basis of colonialism, this idea that there's a mother country, then there's all these satellite countries that are within the sphere of influence of the mother country. And the goal of these smaller countries is to give the mother country its natural resources, its gold, its oil, its this, it's that, in order to enrich the mother country. So this kind of like very pre-colonial but colonial relationship with these little smaller islands and places that were very rich in natural resources. The attitude of those places was not to necessarily build up the infrastructure there and make that a really livable place. It was purely for, okay, they have tobacco. We're going to make commercial plantations of tobacco, and all the tobacco is going to go here, and we're going to enrich the mother country. The mother country will, make it into an actual finished product. They'll trade it around, and they will reap the benefits of what's going on here. So this idea of first world, third world, second world and stuff is all kind of based on colonialism and what happened during this specific time. What the concept of what these actual smaller nations were to these bigger nations that saw the opportunity, took it, and were greedy, was that, you're an extension of me. You're not your own place with your own identity. Your whole purpose is to enrich me and my greed. And that's kind of where we get these, where we look down on these countries. Trump said it, in his speeches, calling these shithole countries or whatever. But they're shitholes because of this, again, constant exploitation, or they're considered shitholes, unsafe or whatever, because of this constant exploitation that's been happening for centuries upon centuries upon centuries, with this attitude that you're not your own thing, you're an extension of me, and your whole purpose is to enrich me. And that attitude has not gone anywhere. Look at how we look at Haiti. Again, we'll get into that in the next episode. Now, as I've talked about it, in the age of exploration, there was this rush for European powers. As soon as Portugal started, the rest were not far behind, but there was this push to be able to find untouched land. For those audio listeners, I'm doing air quotes, to find untouched land in order to be able to enrich themselves. You know what I'm saying? So there was this rush to discover, again, air quotes, these places that had lots of natural resources, had a lot of things that they could enrich themselves with. And the only way for them to do that was to keep production costs low. And the only way to do that was to depend on the slave labor of the enslaved Africans that were exported or taken from Africa to these other regions. All these countries that are considered wealthy, that are considered rich and desirable and Western and, the height of civility, the height of all of these things, all of them got their real, basis in that in slavery. The reason why they are able to be that rich is because they were greedy and they used the age of exploration in order to enrich themselves, and then pulled up the ladder behind them so that no other country could do something similar. So it's important that when you look at these smaller countries that have been colonized, that have had, slave labor, that have had all of these histories of being exploited over and over and over again, understand that when you judge them, you really need to judge their colonial motherland and see all that wealth that they have, that they tote around, that they, put into their infrastructure and their big monuments and their castles, and all of this came from these places. And if you really want to see where the money of these places went, go to Europe, go to America. That is where the money is. It's not that they never had money. They had the most money. But all of their resources and access to, profiting off of the natural resources that was on their land was taken, bamboozled, stolen by force from them in order to enrich those countries. So if you really want to see the wealth of these places, Africa included, go look at Europe, go look at greedy ass Europe and their grubby little hands. They're only that way because of slavery. And we cannot let that slide. It's important for us to acknowledge that point because it's important. they are able to control the narrative because of the power that they've amassed, because of the money that the blood money that they were able to establish their power from. And because they control the narrative, there's no real good faith way to really have this conversation other than putting it within the context of it being a true crime story. These people who were victims were exploited beyond an inch of their life. And then on the back end, their history was flipped, reversed, and made it so they were the villains. They were the people incapable of seeing the opportunity. They were done. They were uncultured. They were uncivilized. They were closer to being inhuman. And that creates this dynamic of us continuing to have these channels, these trade channels open in a very similar predatory way, where we depend on these countries for a lot of our natural resources, and we think that we deserve these natural resources because we've become accustomed to the comforts of having them at our disposal. And because they're in control of the narrative, we think that it's totally normal to have access to these things or to be able to have these things whenever we want to have these things. When in reality, it's still based in predatory, slave adjacent labor that we are not properly compensating these people for. Not only are we not properly compensating these people for in the modern day, we are actively destabilizing their governments, meddling in their politics, murdering and assassinating their leaders, and punishing them on the global stage if they're able to successfully oust our control in order to perpetually keep them in a place of servitude to us and to our needs and to our comforts. So let's keep it a bean when we talk about it, but let's make sure that we talk about the full thing. Now, you may be asking me, oh, that's all well and good, but how does this relate to the Diaspora Wars that I'm forced to get involved with every 1 to 2 months on Twitter or on TikTok? Let's wrap it up.
Socials, baby. Let's talk socials. Hi, my name is Madison, the creator behind the Madison channel. You are here. You are watching my video. Hi, bitch. Let's talk a little bit about my socials. Hit the link in the bio, okay? Hit that link tree. Look at all those links, okay? Now, I will give you 5 seconds to subscribe to the Swan on the following links, okay? Hit those links, subscribe to me, follow me on those platforms. I give you a little bit more of who I am, a little bit more of my personality, a little bit more of my day-to-day. I promise I will be posting more on Instagram. That is my goal for this year, so look out for that. But take your time. I'll count to 5. And just go into the description. I made it easy for you. Go to the link tree and click and follow the Swan on all those links. 5, 4, 3, 2, 2.5, 1. Okay, was it that so hard? But while you're at it, you might as well like, comment, and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Love you. Back to the video.
So I give you a little bit of detail in terms of comparing the different relationship of slavery and slaves between the colonies in North America as well as the colonies in Central and South America and the Caribbean. The different views they had on slavery, which led them to be either less dependent or more dependent on the flow of slaves from the African continent, right? Now, let's hammer this all the way home and close out my thoughts on why I think the Diaspora Wars exist, why I think it's a true crime story, and why it's important for us to talk about. There was not a push to build infrastructure in the Central and South Americas and the Caribbeans as a result of slavery. The point was to extract and suck out as many natural resources as they could with as much free labor as they could in order to enrich the mother country. And because of that dynamic, the population proportions were in favor of the enslaved individuals on that island, right? So when Haiti happened and the reverberations of the Haitian Revolution happened, their goal was to help all of these little islands, all of these areas in Central and South America and the Caribbean free themselves from the European oppressor, which is why they were such a big problem. Again, we will get into all of it, including what's going on in modern day Haiti in next month's episode. But because of that dynamic, when the Europeans left, whether they were forced out or they fled or whatever, they were left to rule themselves, okay? They were left to rule themselves. Now, of course, we're going to talk, of course, European countries meddled. Of course, they destabilized. Of course, they were constantly finding new ways to exploit these populations of people. But at the end of the day, your leader was Black. Your leader was Latino. Your leader was somebody, a person of color, right? Of course, colorism ran rampant. We can have, again, more detail of that conversation in next month's episode. But there was a understanding of a centralized unifying culture that everyone had, from the peasants to the leaders of that nation state. Okay. And as the nation states started to develop their personality, their history, their culture outside of being a slave, a glorified plantation, they were able to mix and meld these things that, they came directly from the motherland. Again, like I was saying a little bit ago, the fact that in the colonies, there was a breaking and a complete severing of having that constant influx of enslaved Africans from the African continent after they figured out having a closed loop system and breeding their slaves with each other. A new identity came out of that. You know what I mean? But in Central and South America, because there was this constant flow till the end, there was a deep connection with African traditions, African religion, African roots, African things that ultimately was morphed into this combination of the indigenous people's culture, African culture, and, other cultures that created the cultural identities of these nation states, of these people. But because of that, and because they ruled themselves, I personally believe there is this stronger affinity amongst West Indians and people from the motherland of Africa, because there's this mutual understanding that, yes, we have been screwed and fucked over and oppressed by Europeans and continue to be in that state of being. But at the end of the day, in Jamaica, Jamaicans rule. And those Jamaicans are, semi-monoracial, even though a lot of these places are super mixed because of their ports and all of that kind of stuff. But you know what I mean? Like, there is this ability to look and see each other where we rule ourselves. Again, I'm doing air quotes. We are the people in power, look like me, look like us, and we're ruling ourselves. Again, air quotes. With the colonies in North America, that was not the case, babe. Okay. We were forced to be left in a place that we were the minority. And we did not have any access to ruling ourselves for many, 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 many years. Still really don't. We are still very much disenfranchised. That's, again, a conversation for another day. But you get what I mean, right? There is this different existence where they are able to rule themselves, have that freedom, and we were left with our abusers who were oppressing us and left to their own devices on what they decided to do with our population, which we had no say in, which we had no control over. Right? So there's that divide in terms of understanding each other and lack of, I think, connection to the motherland itself. So I think that because of that big severance, that creates a line in the sand automatically where West Indians, people from the Caribbean, and Africans from the actual motherland are able to more easily relate to each other because there's lots of overlapping similarities culturally, but there is this you rule over yourself thing. And on top of that, right, at the end of the day, yes, they rule over themselves, but they're also at the whim of the people who we have to make community and live next to. You know what I mean? But that's the flip side of that. Even though we are forced to live in a country with the people directly who oppressed us, they didn't flee. We were the ones that were forced to stay in community with these people who had all control and rule. We are still in America. And because the majority of America is white and European, they hold the strings of controlling the rest of the world. So because we are American and have American passports, there are certain privileges privileges that we get that ups our material circumstances than maybe somebody living in, Haiti or Jamaica at this point in time. You know what I mean? There's a difference in quality of life. There's differences in socially how things work. We have public schools that everybody has access to. You're required by law to go there. In a lot of these other places, school is a privilege. You have to pay for school to go to school. In America, it's expected of you to go to school. You have, even though, don't ask the people in Flint, but our infrastructure for water, for natural resources, for electricity, all of these things are reliable, and that's part of the privilege of being in a country that is majority European, because they have their comforts, they need their comforts, and as a result of that, it trickles down to our quality of life. You see what I mean? So there are these differences in cultural identity for sure. There are privileges and disadvantages on both sides, but we cannot sit here and not understand the fact that these experiences, though it started from the similar thing of slavery, were completely different based on where the boat dropped your ass off at, okay? So Black Americans have been forced to really be on their own in order to create their own identity, their own culture, their own thing. And even at that, some things are related to the motherland, but not as much as someone from Central and South America or the Caribbean, because of that constant flow of people coming from the motherland. So we were truly forced to create our own identity. Who are we? Because we are the descendants of people who were captured from there, but many of us are multiple generations removed from somebody that was actually from Africa, right? Who do we relate to? Where do we fit? That's part of our African-American cultural struggle. We struggle with this all the time. And I think a lot of us crave that connection that we just don't have, because I think as time has worn on, we are different. We are different. We have a different identity. We have a different experience. Now, because of these separating things, the next layer is how immigrants from Africa, the West Indies, and all of that have been strategically used by the American government to quell, to dispel, to mystify, to confuse the very real calls for equality from African American people. And this is an incredibly important point that I think gets lost. So let me just, pontificate on it for a second. The civil rights movement started in 1955 after the death of Emmett Till. It really kickstarted it, right? And from the 1950s onward, there were so many civil rights movements that were gaining steam and being successful, gaining international attention. These demands for equality were actually being pushed publicly, and people were forced to contend with the reality that if you were Black in America, you were a second-class citizen, right? 1960s happened. You had the Voting Rights Act. You had, in 1964, you had the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, you had all of these major leaders, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all of these different organizations, SNCC, SCLC, the Freedom Riders, all of these different things that were really pushing the America to actually be what it says it is on paper. If you are the land of the free, if you are the home of the brave, if people are self-determining here and they can have control of their own life, then really you need that to be for real. You need to you can't say that while having an entire population of people that is barred access from basic rights, who have no control over who's voted into office, who have no control over these things. You cannot say that. So that time period, like 1955 into the 70s, was volatile, tumultuous, was insane. But because of the sacrifices of African Americans continuously fighting for the right to be here, the right to exist in America, and to have rights on top of that, there was a bunch of subsequent things that happened because the push of African Americans for equality, because we were not just pushing for ourselves, we were pushing for everybody. So the women's rights movement gained steam. Second wave feminism gained steam during this time. You have the gay rights movement gaining steam during this time. You had things like Title IX. You have, different things. And one of those situations that came from and is inspired by the work done in the civil rights movement was the Immigration Act of 1965. I believe it's 1965, if I'm not mistaken. Now, the Immigration Rights Act was an act that basically allowed people to immigrate to the United States despite your race. Before, it was more controlled. Before, there were certain bans on certain people coming in. Now they lifted that ban, and there was this actual want legally in the United States system to actually have diverse people come into this country. And this was pushed for, again, as from people who were inspired by what the work that was done during the civil rights movement by African American people. So Immigration Act of 1965 opens the borders to more people than ever in the United States, and more people immigrate here. Now, what a lot of people don't understand by this is that this was a double-edged sword. Yes, it was a win, but at the same time, the United States powers that be had a different motive for allowing this to happen. Okay. And I'm not xenophobic. No, I am the granddaughter of immigrants, but there was another agenda that a lot of people were not privy to, particularly the immigrants that came to the United States. What you don't know is there was a creation of something called the model minority myth. Now, a lot of people associate the model minority myth with Asian immigrants, people who came here, Asian American people. They associate and hold that title for them specifically. But realistically, the model minority myth includes people that came from the African continent, people that came from the West Indies during this specific time period when the borders were opened up. Because that law, all these laws that are put into place, oftentimes that front-facingly look like they're actually going to better this country, usually they do that because they have a whole other intention. The model minority myth essentially talks about and is centralized around the Asian identity, but it's for, to me, in my opinion, all immigrants that came at this time. A lot of people don't get this, but the immigrants that were allowed in were handpicked. Okay, you weren't just Joe Schmo coming in. If you went through at this specific time during, and went through the process at this specific time, you were likely picked if you were college educated, higher class, a doctor, a professional in where you came from. So this is important to understand. You're allowed to come in. You have, experience working these professional jobs that a lot of African American people proper had to climb completely uphill to even have access to, right? To even be able to achieve, right? So you're bringing these people in with this experience, and they're able to establish this life for themselves. And the United States government gives them little privileges with their visas, with their citizenship, little things that, seem inconsequential because the plight of being an immigrant is difficult. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of other things. There's a lot of discrimination. There's a lot of things that you face just inherently. But there are little things about how you came in here that was strategized specifically by the United States government in order to ensure that your quality of life was just different. Okay. So a lot of these immigrants came, African, West Indian, came during this time, and they were able to build a life for themselves that far surpassed the lives that African Americans that were living here were able to build for themselves. And they were told it's because you actually work hard. It's because you're not lazy. It's because you're this. It's because you're that. They were fed stereotypes of African American people who lived, born, bred generationally in this country. They were fed stereotypes, and they looked down jointly on African Americans. And the position of looking down was, you live here. I had to come here from my country. I had to leave my family behind. I had to sacrifice this. I had to do this. I had to go back to school and do this. And I'm living a better life than you. It's really true that this country isn't racist. This country is the country of opportunity, and you're squandering your opportunity even though you live here. Now, that attitude was sowed in specifically by the United States government, as to not create solidarity and prevent solidarity between Asian people, any other immigrant that came during that time, right? What they did was they were able to successfully use these people as a propaganda tool. So everyone, even though successes had been made and people were listening to Black Americans at that time in their plight, now you can't sit here and say this country's racist when this Asian guy is a doctor and this African guy is an engineer here. You can't sit here and call this the land of opportunity fucked up and racist. It clouds the very binary true things that was happening before. It clouds that ability to say that, because now they can point to their tokens and say, well, he did it. He did it and he's from Africa. He did it and he's from China. He had to learn another language. You live here. What's wrong with you? And that's the whole insidious goal of that, right? So because of that, and because a lot of immigrants at the time took on that, they took on being in that role, being the token, not realizing that tokens get spent. So yes, you're the token, you're the one shucking and jiving for them at a moment, but let the wrong cop get you at the right day. They will see your African ass and say, oh, you're a Black man, and kill you. You still, and no matter how much we African Americans have warned, particularly African people and West Indian people, of this dichotomy, of this truth, like, they're not going to stop and listen to your accent if they want to kill you. Their trigger finger is itching, honey. So they're not going to stop and do their due diligence. If they see a Black person, they respond like you're a Black person. As much as we have tried to say that, they will still turn around and look at us and say, well, you're lazy. Well, you're jealous. Well, you're this. You're ghetto. You're this. You squandered your opportunity. I don't know what's wrong with you. And they become the newest obstacle against full equality, instead of people that listen and hear what we're saying and heed our warning. So that hardens the lines, right? If that is also happening in America proper, so now African Americans have this very closed off way of interacting. They have this very closed off way because we don't trust you. We don't trust that you don't think the same of us as the white people told you to think of us. You know what I mean? And again, that makes them closed off, the immigrants closed off, because it's like, well, I don't want your laziness rubbing off on my kid. I don't want this rubbing off on my children, da 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 da. And so it brings us to modern day, where we have this hurt on multiple sides. I think this hurt from the sides of West Indians and Africans of not being fully embraced, but not understanding that they were brainwashed before they came here, and their attitudes against us made us repel them. You know what I mean? It was the stirring of white supremacy within that dynamic that poisoned it from the beginning, and the loophole that they intentionally baked in order, to use these people as tokens, as examples, in order to further distance themselves from the responsibilities that they had for African Americans in the conditions that they're in, and the inability for these people that look like you to hear you say, we've tried everything with these people. We tried to separate and make our own places. That didn't work. They bombed us. Tulsa. We tried to coexist. That didn't work. The KKK. We've tried upward mobility. We tried being in the army. We tried all of these avenues that they say are open to everybody. But, the quiet part is anybody that isn't Black American. We've talked to them. We've said, we've been sabotaged. It's not that we haven't tried. It's that whenever we try something, there is this push by the establishment to teach us a lesson and to make an example out of us. So a lot of us have stopped trying. And the added layer of the reason why these borders are opened up and this opportunity is opened up to you, your ability to gain, loans and different things that we are, again, barred from, discriminated from, is because of the work that we did in the civil rights movement. So instead of saying, thank you for what you did, thank you for this, we are going to work together to build solidarity. I'm going to use my position in this way to help the people here that have been here. You turn your back on us and say, you don't have culture, you're lazy, you're ghetto, you're the reason why you're in the position you're in, and you become a mouthpiece for white supremacy. You see what I mean? So there's generations of deep hurt on both sides for multiple reasons. But what I will say is when you're siding with and believing what white supremacy is telling you, you become the enemy to us. You become the enemy to the African American population. Then the conversations about lack of culture, when African American culture is American culture. It is pop culture. It is what makes the entire world. And because it's pop culture in America, everyone's looking at our culture and taking a piece of it. But it's never respected because even from people in our diaspora, because it's assumed that we're just lazy, ghetto, and have nothing going on. It's funny, I'll close it out here. I made a video about Kai Cenat on my TikTok on his stream. He's Haitian. And I made a video about how on his stream he said, you're black, you don't have culture, you're uncultured. You're not Haitian, you're not Jamaican, you're not West Indian, you're not blah, blah, blah. He said that verbatim, basically. And it's important for me to point that out, because these attitudes that stem literally from slavery are still affecting how we are able to relate to each other. And this false sense of superiority is non-existent, particularly in Kai's situation, because it's not lost on me that the only reason why he's successful is by commenting on Black culture, hip hop culture. He's important. He's made money. He's made millions off of our culture. Same thing with Akon. You're rapping with a Caesar fade, which is our culture, but you're going to sit here in an interview and say Black people have no culture. That's crazy. So I say all this to say there's a world of hurt on all sides. There is an inability to want to take accountability for the contributions on all sides of that hurt. And it is insanely important that we go back in history to try and figure out where all of this started. Instead of just listening to what you're told to believe about populations of people, go back in history and see the history and see where, okay, maybe I am being used as a tool. Maybe I am a token. Maybe there was another purpose for me coming here, and it wasn't just to help me, with upward mobility for my people and my family. Maybe what these people who lived here, existed here, have been tortured and abused by these people their entire existence, have something to say and are trying to tell you the truth of who you're dealing with and why you shouldn't side with these people. A lot of accountability needs to be had, but I think, unfortunately, this is the unseen consequences as to why the more psychological shit that happened as a result of slavery really is the true crime story. That is the meat and potatoes of the true crime story. Not only did the racial hierarchy come out of slavery that, again, affects all of our day-to-day lives and is still killing us to this day, but the inability for us to unify under African descendants, African diaspora, specifically because of the way white supremacy uses and controls and divides us, is another situation of a true crime story. It's intentional, it's predatory, it's meant to disrupt, it's meant to leave us so fractured that we're unable to fight against the very real, very consistent powers that have dominated all of us. All of us Black people, all of us people in the Black diaspora, it's the same people responsible for our oppression at the top. And it's just so important that we understand that and we realize that. And we understand that a lot of the information we've been fed about each other isn't always accurate. You know what I mean? I say all this to say, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I love you guys. Next episode, we're going to be discussing the Haitian Revolution. I am so excited for this episode. So I hope we're going to do a full historical breakdown of the Haitian Revolution. So I hope you're excited about that. That being said, hit the link in the bio, subscribe to all the socials, subscribe to the Swan, and without further ado, Black Lives Matter, Free Palestine until it's backwards. Mwah, love you.